Okay, next we have Alicia. I'm going to just let her, she's here, so I'm just going to let her start. All right. Sorry. Thank you, Alicia. Okay, so I'm a bit of an outlier here. I'm an engineer. And my goal in coming was to kind of show some of the platforms and devices that we've been developing in our lab that we would like to apply to new problems. So this is some work that we did on looking at the uptake of nanoplastics by Mahi Mahi. And so basically we're looking at nanoplastics. They come from a variety of sources. They can either come in from the breakdown of large-scale plastics and degradation while they're in the environment, or they can come into the ocean and the waterways as engineered particles. So they're coming in already in their nano form. And what's important about nanoplastics as opposed to microplastics is that they're much smaller. And that means that they have a much larger surface area to volume ratio. So they, and they are also because of that large surface area, they're also subject to larger forces from the surfaces, and aggregation of ions and things like that can play a more important role than they do when you talk about macro scale things. And one of the biggest things that we found is that you have very different aggregation behavior because of the ionic interactions. Imagine like you have a plus and a minus coming together. With the nanoparticles, they'll aggregate. And the consequences of this are that they transfer fast and far because they're small. They can come into organisms through multiple exposure routes. You can have nanoplastics in the water that are then ingested by the fish, or they can come up through the food chain. Because they're so small, they can migrate through tissues, and they can absorb and release contaminants relatively quickly, and they bond differently again because of this ionic and the surface charge with the cell membranes. So, limitations of existing studies. There was limited stuff. We started this in around 2020. Since then, there has been a lot more studies, but size-dependent toxicities, how did the size of the nanoplastic affect the toxicity? Most studies were in vitro, and in vivo, there were a few studies, but they were mostly freshwater zebrafish, and because the nanoplastics behave very differently in freshwater and saltwater, those results are not directly transferable at all to marine systems. Generally, the exposure is static, so you're just putting these things in a beaker or a fish tank and adding in the nanoplastics, and the result there is that you get sedimentation. It's not evenly distributed, and you're not mimicking flow, which is really important in marine systems. And often the analysis is endpoint, so you're measuring, you're putting them in, you're exposing them for a time, and then you take them out and stick them under the microscope. And again, in vivo was mainly through waterborne exposure, not food exposure. So my area of research is microfluidics. That's any fluids, water, seawater, at the very small scales. So essentially what we did was build, so microfluidics have been used a lot in the bio research area, pharmaceutical, drug discovery, things like that, not so much in marine sciences. What we did basically was build a mini fish tank, or a micro fish tank, that we could put under a microscope and then image in real time how the fish were uptaking the nanoplastics. We also added in very sensitive optical oxygen sensors so that we could measure their metabolic rates. Well, we started off using proof of concept with things that we didn't kill initially in our lab. So we wanted to go straight to Mahi Mahi. We were not great at keeping them alive. So we went back a step and we were working with algae and Artemia. But what we were trying to do was to do a two-step exposure. So we looked at the Artemia exposed just to the nanoplastics, and then we looked at what happened if we exposed the algae to nanoplastics and then and then had the Artemia eat the algae that were exposed to nanoplastics. So the big chamber is for the hyotrophic animals. Chamber A, is for the higher trophic animals. Chamber B was for the lower trophic animals. Here it was microalgae. And then we had micro pillars that were a pain in the neck to put in as a technical challenge to stop the algae. So we wanted to control when the Artemia were exposed to the algae and when not. So we were controlling what the exposure was. And this is overall the experimental setup that we had. So we stick it under a microscope. We have a PID controller to control the heat, the temperature, the oxygen meter, syringe pump controlled the flow, so we could have dynamic flow conditions, not just static exposure. And we could also run multiple experiments in parallels to help us get statistical data. And here's some pictures of the accumulation of the nanoplastics. You can see this. The first one is the Artemia control. Then we have waterborne exposure, foodborne exposure, and so the foodborne is through the algae, algae control and algae waterborne exposure. So you can see that all of them uptook the nanoplastics that they were affected to, and we had significant differences between the waterborne and foodborne exposure. So we thought that was pretty cool and interesting. And then we also measured the dissolved oxygen, and we saw differences as well here between whether they were foodborne or waterborne exposure. And yes, so then we wanted to look at Mahi Mahi, but we had so we were collaborating on this with a aquaculture lab at University of Rhode Island, and we were initially trying to transfer the embryos to us at FIU, because that's where we had all the microscopy set up. We were not successful, so in the end, my student ended up taking his stuff to URI, but because he didn't have the microscope that we needed there, we were not able to get real-time data, but we only have specific time points. But still, the results were pretty cool. And we were able to do fancier imaging as well with the non-moving fish, which was pretty challenging. So the conditions that we had were exposure. Here the food was rotifers, and my Latin is not that great. I'm an engineer. So yeah, the food was rotifers. The fish were Mahi Mahi. We had different concentrations of exposure. And here you see the control rotifer and the nanoplastic exposed rotifer. And you can see the nanoplastics. That's the red dot. And here are Mahi Mahi. And you can see the control versus nanoplastic exposure. Our nanoplastics are not, they're fluorescent engineered nanoplastics that we buy commercially. They're red. So where you see that bright redness. Oh, which one is this? The laser is the big one. Okay, here we go. So where you see this red as the nanoplastic uptake in the fish, and this was different lengths of exposure. It was interesting that they stopped, that the exposure, the uptake was maximum after 48 hours, and we think that's because they started to not eat so much because they weren't feeling great after that much exposure. And you can see we then also looked at what happens if we expose them and then we run a depuration period, so where they're exposed only to clean water. And one of the not great things that we saw was they never fully expelled the nanoplastics. So even after depuration period, that was even longer than their original exposure period, they're still maintaining those nanoplastics. These are some images that we did with a confocal microscope that allows us to take like slices and stack them, so we can get a kind of 3D understanding of how they're distributed inside the fish. Clearly, this one was exposed to way too many nanoplastics. And so we can look at the, as you would expect, you have highest accumulation in the gut, but we did see that the nanoparticles dispersed to other body parts as well. And then we took those samples and we did some histopathology with them, and we saw basically damage in the gut. Again, these weren't exposed for a super long time, there were, at most, we had like some damage in the gut with these. And so the conclusions that we had were nanoplastics are persistent. They're staying even after you clean up. So the earlier we deal with this is probably the better. Even short-term exposure is impacting development or mortality. Our real-time oxygen monitoring was associated with mortality outcomes. I didn't really show that here, but we could kind of predict the mortality by looking at the oxygen levels. Microfluidic studies, obviously we're mini fish tanks, so we're limited to early stage development, but that's a really critical part of development. So there's a lot to be done there. Future things that we're playing around with, originally we didn't want to just look at oxygen, we wanted to look at total ammonia and nitrogen as a secondary metabolic indicator. The technology for that does not exist. We're trying to develop it. We would like to look at other marine species. We would like to look at realistic nanoplastics, not just sample lab ones. And another totally little bit disrelated is microfluidics to understand coral growth. This is my graduate student who did all the work. This is Dr. Terry Bradley at URI, who helped us with all the bio and the fish stuff. And Arifsara, we did some AI analysis of the uptake as well, and he helped with that. Thank you.